We're here today to talk about research, and we're a beautiful modern society. We have all kinds of modern institutions, including this wonderful institution of peer review, journal publishing, which just makes sure that everything that gets published is vetted by experts and absolutely reliable and interesting at all times, except maybe not. And so I want to start out by asking a question. What are some of the shortcomings? What are some of the flaws that exist in our academic publishing systems today that might get in the way of it serving the function that we hope it will? David, I think I'll start with you. What are some of those flaws and drawbacks of the status quo today?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and for putting on this panel. So there are a couple of different ways I've thought about sort of answering this. There's one of the most sort of frequent complaints, or the frequent things that are kind of easy to point out, is that it's a 21st century system that's really being run on the bones of 19th century type of processes and workflows. But it's not that's not usually where I'll sort of emphasize some of the issues. A lot of the old processes, or a lot of the sort of fundamental ways that science should progress, are just fine. But a lot of those systems that we put in place really don't take into account some of those more idealistic workflows and processes and philosophies. We refer frequently, and it's almost universally applauded in the academic community, the so-called Mertonian norms that have been that Robert Merton published back in the 1940s, sort of talking about universal access to data so that everyone can look at the same information, being skeptical, and he refers to it as organized skepticism, really looking at evidence in a non-dogmatic way. I mean, that's very tough, but a very kind of important thing to try to set up in a structured way, and being disinterested in what the actual truth is, and not being too dogmatic with how we want to look at the theories that we have, or the evidence that we want to present, but really having that idealistic search for truth on the process. And unfortunately, we are all humans, and we have our own biases that kind of get in the way of getting through that process. So we often look at the academic publishing system. We look at the results of work once they're known to us, and so when you see something that works the way you expect it to, or doesn't work the way you didn't expect it to, those preliminary expectations really cloud your perception of what the evidence is saying or is not saying. So there are, and I'll get into it in a little bit, but there are structures and workflows and processes to really take those type of biases into account, so that we can set up really rigorous tests in ways that are fair to the perhaps both sides of different points of view, or both sides of the predictions or the theoretical expectations that could result, based on the work that's about to be done. So to summarize, I'd basically say that the system is created without some of those idealistic norms that really should be at the forefront of how we design our assessment of what evidence is saying or is not saying.
Mm-hmm. So just to make sure I'm following, so if I'm an individual researcher, maybe I have a Mertonian ideal in mind, but I also have all kinds of biases and maybe incentives that give me an interest in finding what I hope to find that will help me get a job, that'll help my resume. And maybe you multiply that across all of academia, it starts to skew what gets published. Do I have that right?
Yeah, in fact, it's very widely seen through surveys that almost all researchers kind of subscribe to those ideals, but we can't get necessarily past them once we see our lizard brains, so to speak, get in the way. Once we start to try to critically evaluate something that contradicts what we expect it to say.
Thank you so much. So Adam, maybe I can bring you in here. You've, I think, seen some similar challenges in the academic research world, but I have a feeling you might go even further. So are there additional flaws that you spot as you look out at academic research today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of a whole bizarro layer cake of things that make no sense. I mean, beginning with the money, which everyone who's in research understands how it works, but not why it works this way. So most academic research is behind a paywall, and you have to pay somewhere between like 20 and $100 if you want to get a single paper. And if you're actually doing any research, obviously a single paper is not going to be, you've got to get hundreds of papers. And so unless you have an institutional affiliation and your institution is dropping millions of dollars every year to have access to all these journals, you just don't get to have it unless you use, and I of course would never encourage you to use, an illegal website like Sci-Hub. That is of course evil and bad. But ostensibly, if you are a law-abiding citizen, if you don't have an academic access, you just don't get to know the fruits of knowledge, which it's hard to look at that and I think not go crazy. This idea that like most of this research is funded by taxpayers, and then there's like this rent-seeking class in the middle that extracts all of the money, who don't do the work. They like provide very little additional labor that makes the work any better, and in fact I think they often make it worse. And then they like rake in the proceeds. That part I think makes no sense. But even without that, like even if we didn't have that problem, I think the problem, or there's a greater problem, which is that the way that we publish now has produced basically a scientific monoculture. That until about a generation ago, there were many different ways that people communicated their results. Some were much more akin to a newspaper or a magazine. Some were proceedings of scientific societies. Some were letters that were published. And all of these different ways of publishing serve different ends and allow people to operate with different incentives. Now we have basically one system that if you are a working academic, the way that you acquire status is by publishing in the best journal that you can publish in. And those journals are all selecting on pretty similar things. They operate in pretty similar ways. The main differences between them are just the content that they publish. And so that incentivizes everyone to basically try to do the same thing. Like every researcher's dream is to get a paper into Science or Cell or whatever, which means that we don't have people pursuing idiosyncratic incentives and doing weird things. Everyone is trying to do the same thing. And so there's all sorts of research questions that never get asked or data that never gets published because it doesn't get people into those journals. And I think this is basically, I think, a huge loss that's hard to even see because it's just something that never happens. Like these papers never get published, the ideas never get out there, the data never gets out there. And I think that is the biggest problem with the system, not the system itself, but what it prevents from existing. That I think we have a system that's optimized for certain kinds of outputs, but when you're optimized for one thing, it means you can't be optimized for other things. And so basically we have an ecosystem in which everyone is trying to be a mammal. And it's like no one's trying to be a lizard and no one's trying to be a lichen and no one's trying to be like a sea cucumber. And because of that, we have an ecosystem where a few people will survive and most people will starve. And probably the whole thing will collapse because we don't have that kind of diversity that allows the sort of vibrancy of different ideas and different approaches and different answers to questions.